So good morning everyone, to my fellow classmates in this course, New Testament Survey 2, and to our Professor, Pastor, Reverend Paul Songjun Lee. Good morning. I am Annalyn Holoyohoy, and I will be discussing to you now the 20th book of the New Testament, which is the book of James. So let us start this with our three guiding questions that will lead us into our understanding of this book of James. So first, this book raises a question like, how can we be faithful friends of God like Abraham? Second, can we resist the pressures of the world, our rebellious human impulses, and the influence of the devil? Can Christians live together in peace as we seek solutions to life's problems? So James addresses these issues in his letter as he seeks to motivate Christians to develop a mature and consistent faith, and to show how Christians can have loyal friendship with God and with one another. So let us continue to the introduction of this book. So the letter of James is written in good Koine Greek, the common Greek of the Greco-Roman world. It reflects, so according to scholars, this book reflects the Hellenistic influences on Galilee and Palestine, as well as the enculturation of Jewish readers in the diaspora. James writes with grammatical accuracy, has a wide vocabulary, and has an elegant feel for the rhythms and sounds of words. Next. So James uses many oratorical devices, such as fraternal appeals, which can be read in the first chapter of the book, verse 2, the second chapter, verse 1, third chapter, verse 1, and the fourth chapter, verse 11. Next, rhetorical questions, which can be read in the second chapter, verse 5, third chapter, verse 11 to 12, and in the fourth chapter, verse 1. Imperative exhortations, to be read in the first chapter, verse 16, third chapter, verse 1, fifth chapter, verse 16. Metaphors and illustrations, second chapter, verse 26, in the third chapter, verses 3 to 5, and in the fourth chapter can be read in verse 14. And aphorisms that summarize a paragraph, that can be read in the second chapter, verse 13 and 17, third chapter, verse 18, in the fourth chapter, verse 17. So these fraternal appeals, rhetorical questions, imperative exhortations, metaphors and illustrations, and aphorisms that summarize a paragraph are the oratorical devices that James used in writing this book. So James was the brother of Jesus, half-brother of Jesus, writes as leader of Jerusalem church to Jewish Christians who have been scattered by persecution. So he wrote this book as a leader of the Jerusalem church. He encourages them to endure their trials with Christian fortitude and to exhibit consistent Christian character. So it is written with a pastor's perspective, and it focuses more on ethics than any other book of the New Testament. So this letter contains teachings based on the law as understood through the life and teaching of Jesus Christ. So it can be read in the first chapter verse 25 and the second chapter verse 8. So James also reflects Jesus' own teachings, especially as later recorded in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew, it can be read in Matthew chapter 5 to 7, and Luke's Sermon in the Plain, Luke 6 verses 20 to 49. So the book of James, so the book of James looks a bit like the Old Testament book of Proverbs, dressed up in New Testament clothes. So we already heard that this book of James is considered as Proverbs in the New Testament. Its consistent focus on practical action in the life of faith is reminiscent of the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. So this is an evidence that this book of James looks like the Old Testament book of Proverbs dressed up in the New Testament clothes because of its practical action in the life of faith as a reminiscent of the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. So it encourages God's people to act like God's people. So the pages of James are filled with direct commands to pursue a life of holiness. He makes no excuses for those who do not measure up. So in the mind of this early church leader, James, Christians evidence their faith by walking in certain ways and not others. For James, a faith that does not produce real life change is a faith that is worthless, as what is written in this book. Faith without works is dead. So as one of the chief leaders in the church at Jerusalem, James wrote from that city prior to the meeting of the Jerusalem Council, which Luke recorded in Acts 15. So let us go on now to the authorship of this book. So the letter of James was written by one of Jesus' brothers. So who is this brother? Like the other sons of Joseph and Mary, written in Matthew 13:55, James, Greek Jacobus, bore the name of an Israelite hero, Jacob, in Hebrew, Yaakov, in Greek, Jacob. So after Jesus' resurrection, James became a believer and rose to a position of leadership in the Jerusalem church. So we can read it in the book of Acts chapter 15 verses 13 to 22. So during Jesus' public ministry, neither James nor the other siblings were followers of Jesus. They had even tried to end his ministry and bring him home to his responsibilities as the eldest son. So we can read this story in the book of Mark chapter 3 verses 31 to 35. So a personal resurrection appearance convinced James that Jesus was the Christ, and he was with the others on Pentecost. So we can read it both in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 7 and in the book of Acts chapter 1 verse 14 to the second chapter verse 1 to 3. So James became the leader of the church, leader of the Jerusalem church after Peter's arrest and departure from Jerusalem. So we can read this account in the book of Acts chapter 12 verse 1 to 3, chapter 13 to 21, chapter 21, verse 18, and in the book of Galatians, chapter 1, verse 19, and in the second chapter, verse 9. So let us proceed on to the recipients of this book or this letter. So the recipients of this letter were Jewish Christians. We can read it in the first chapter of the book of James, verse 1, in the second chapter, verse 1. Who had been scattered by the persecutions which began with stoning of Stephen. So we can read it in Acts, chapter 8, verse 1, chapter 11, verse 19. So they lived among the Jews who had been scattered abroad in the diaspora, which had its origin in the Assyrian dispersion of Israel. The northern kingdom, in 722 to 721 BC, and in the Babylonian exile of Judah, the southern kingdom, in 586 BC. So the dispersion later included many Jews who traveled extensively during the Greek and Roman empires. So we can read it in the 4th chapter of the book verse 13, and in the book of Acts, chapter 13, verse 14, chapter 17, verse 1. By the middle of the 1st century, there were Jewish communities all over the Greco-Roman world. As one of the chief leaders in the church at Jerusalem, James wrote from the city prior to the meeting of the Jerusalem Council, which Luke recorded in Acts 15. Now let us proceed to the place and date of writing of this book. So the letter of James is one of the earliest books in the New Testament, written after the persecution under Herod Agrippa on AD 44, and can be read in the book of Acts chapter 12, verses 1 to 5. Yet prior to Galatians AD 48 to 49, and in the council in Jerusalem AD 49 to 50. So this book reflects an early period prior to the conflict over circumcising Gentile converts and before the development of false teachings in other Christian communities. It was a time when synagogue, what we call meeting, and church were interchangeable terms as were law and word. That this letter was written from Jerusalem is deduced from information in Acts and Galatians about James' location. You can read it in Acts chapter 15, 13 to 22, chapter 21, verse 18, and in the book of Galatians chapter 1, verse 18 to 19, chapter 2, verse 9, and verse 12. So the book contains allusions appropriate to Palestine, including references to the scorching heat, verse 1:11, salty water springs, verse 3, chapter 3, verse 11, the cultivation of figs, olives, and grapevines, chapter 3, verse 12, the imagery of the sea, chapter 1, verse 6, and chapter 3, verse 4, and the early and later rains, chapter 5, verse 7. So let us proceed to the purpose of writing. So what was the purpose of James in writing this book or this letter? So James' primary concern is for his readers to maintain undivided faith and loyalty toward God. So it can be read in the first chapter, verse 6. So during this time, they were under pressure from a society that oppressed them economically and abused them for their faith in Jesus Christ. So it can be read in the second chapter, verse 6 to 7. So James recommends patient endurance, submission to God, and sharing in the ministries of the church. So this will result in perfection, honor, and a glorious life at the coming of Jesus Christ. So James gave instructions for the Jews who were dispersed or spread abroad and well beyond the Jerusalem church, and so he wanted them to stay connected with the body of Christ. So James provided biblical methods for praying, having faith, how to suffer, controlling the tongue, what works and salvations have to do with one another, a dead faith, doing and not merely hearing. He chastises the rich, comforts the poor, shows how to acquire wisdom, and what true religion really is, which can be read in James 1:27, James 2 verse 6, and James 5 verse 1 to 2. So the purpose is manifold in the book of James because he talks so much about the Christian faith and examining ourselves to see if we are bearing works worthy of a genuine Christian. So James distinctively emphasizes friendship as the ideal relationship with God according to William Baker. Now let's proceed to the last part of this report, the outline of the book or the letter of James. So this letter starts with a greeting from James. Can be read in chapter 1 verse 1. Next, the discussion of faith and endurance, which can be read in the first chapter verse 2 to 18, and in the discussion of listening and doing, not just hearing the word but a doer, but be doers of the word that you hear or that you have read. So which can be read in chapter 1 verse 19 to 27. Next is the discussion of poverty and generosity, which can be read in chapter 2 verse 1 to 26. So it includes a warning against prejudice, which can be read in chapter 2 verse 1 to 13. Next, faith without good deeds is dead. Faith without works is dead, which can be read in chapter 2 verse 14 to 26. Next was the discussion about speech and conflict, chapter 3 verse 1 to chapter 4 verse 3. It includes this speech and conflict discussion includes the controlling of the tongue, which can be read in chapter 3 verse 1 to 12. Next, the true wisdom comes from God, conflict from selfish prayer. Next is the drawing close to God discussion that includes seeking God's favor and resisting the devil. Next, it includes the warning against judging others, warning about self-confidence, warning to the rich. Next, the final exhortation. So it includes James' final exhortation includes discussion of patience and endurance, the power of prayer, restoring wandering believers. So this ends here my report regarding the book of James. So thank you and shalom.